Our next question comes from Jordana Smith, who's speaking through a sign language interpreter.
The Employment Assistance Fund, it's to help people who have a disability in the workplace, but the funding is strictly limited. For example, sign language interpreters are capped at $6,000 a year, which is enough for 6 full days at work. That doesn't cover meetings and training. So what happens after that is that we miss out. Do you have any plans to increase funding to access to employment for deaf people?
Bill Shorten.
That's a pretty good question. In terms of the Employment Assistance Fund, we think, and I certainly believe, that just because someone's got a disability doesn't mean that they should be put in a different pile and not given the chance to be employed. I'll take on board the suggestion about the restrictions on assistance for AusSign or people who do sign language in terms of training. But beyond that, so I'll take that on board. That's just a good point. You can't argue with that.
Would you be prepared to consider increasing the funding? Because that's the key question there. The funding is capped at $6,000, it said, which is enough for just 6 days. Now, 6 days in the course of a year, if you're trying to get a job, not very much.
This may or may not pass the Ruslan test, but the answer is yes, I think it's a good point. So I will take it on board. But beyond that, disability employment generally, the unemployment rates for people with disabilities is still ridiculous in Australia. By ridiculous, what I mean is that there's still, I don't think it's conscious discrimination, but there's a lot of unconscious prejudice. Because people present differently, they don't get the same chances. I probably also think it's time that, working with Australian companies, that if you employ more than 100 people, those companies could report the number of people with disabilities annually that they employ. Because I think there's a lot of people who think that it's too hard to employ people with disabilities, whereas I actually just think it's that people are unfamiliar with the system and that given changes in adaptive technology, like there's a whole lot of Australians who, if we get smart, could go to work. So the access to signing's one thing, but I also think we just need to get a lot of companies saying that not everyone we hire has to look like us.
Are you talking about a mandatory reporting system for all companies, reporting how many people with disabilities they're employing?
Yeah, it's not government policy, but it's my view. Something's got to change. You can't just keep doing things the same way and then expect a different outcome. I think that it's not a case that you set quotas, but I do think it's a case that it's probably time. In Australia, it would be once a year in your annual report. It's just not that hard.
Is it sort of shaming companies
into
doing better, or just getting more transparency around this?
It's not even shaming, because I don't think, I'm not saying, it's just getting people to think about it. You look at a lot of companies hire people through search agencies, and I just think that there's a lot of filters between the person with the impairment getting to the interview and getting to the job, and all of us can do it smarter. The public sector the federal public sector is committed to do more. But anyway, I just think it's a no-brainer. Disability employment, big area of disadvantage. And for not a lot of effort, we can unlock a whole lot of productive people who are currently just not on the radar.
I'll hear from both the other politicians. Julie Bishop first.
I am aware of a number of very good programs in my state of Western Australia through disability services to encourage employers to take on people with disabilities, and I've certainly seen some great results from those sorts of programs. At a federal level, I'm interested to hear about the cap. I hadn't appreciated that there was a $6,000 cap that translated into 6 days of AusLAN or interpreting services. And I'd be very keen to know, as I'm sure Bill would be, as to how many people would actually benefit greatly from an increase in the ability to access those services, and how their chances or opportunities of getting a job or remaining in work are being hampered by not having at least 6 days. So I think that would be a very interesting piece of evidence for us to all learn about.
What do you think about the mandatory reporting idea that has just been raised here?
I'm really not keen on government mandating small business to take on even more
let's say
red tape.
employees and above.
Well, that's still a small business in some instances. I'm just not keen on government mandating more red tape, more regulation on small business. After all, we should be encouraging small business to make it easier for them to employ people, not harder. And so I'm sure we can be more creative about encouraging businesses to be aware of the great talent, skill and capabilities that people who have a disability
Okay, we've got a hand up in
bring.
the front there. We'll just quickly go to that.
I'd just like to ask if there's the possibility of the government leading by example and employing a lot of these people with disabilities.
Yeah.
And even in addition to that, making it more public about the benefits of recruiting persons with a disability, about diversity in the workplace, etc.
Right, now we'll get a very brief answer from Bill Shorten on that. Very brief, if you don't mind.
The Australian Public Sector Commission has recently announced a new plan to employ more people with disabilities. There's a lot of good success stories out there in small and medium-sized business, but just before Conservatives chip the idea of saying, oh, it's more red tape for companies, if you keep doing things the same way and simply hope that something will change, well, then what we're doing is we're consigning the same people to the same poor outcomes. I don't think it's a big leap just to simply once a year get companies thinking, actually, how many people with a disability do we employ? The public service does it. I just don't think it's the big leap of red tape which Julie was characterising it as.
Bill, if that were the only regulation you were imposing on small business, I'd say fine. But we don't want to burden business to the point where they don't employ people. We want to make it easier for
on this
people to
subject,
employ.
before I come to you, Christine, we've got a tweet from Janet backstage. Mr Kogan, you have a big business. Will you offer a job to someone with a disability?
Yeah, certainly. Look, you know, in terms of my company, it's all a meritocracy. So all of our staff are remunerated based on the value they add to the business. There's some staff that have had multiple pay rises every year. We pay very high wages. We do our best to try and attract the best. Now, if someone has a disability but they can still perform a certain task very well, we have absolutely no issue employing them to perform that task. So, you know, if someone, for instance, like we just saw ask the question, they could be fine at typing emails and replying to people by email. There's absolutely no issue there. So we would be more than happy to employ those people, and that's how our company operates. It's a meritocracy.
Christine Milne.
Well, I think it's a terrific proposal to employ more people with disabilities, but I go back to we're hearing from both the Coalition and Labor that they think it's a good idea, but I come back to the fact, yes, it is a great idea, but when are they going to say where the money's going to come from? Because everybody knows that there are students in our schools at the moment who are disabled, and schools are trying to get volunteers to come in to help those kids because there is not the money to pay for carers, to pay for the assistants, to pay for everything that needs to happen. And so what's happening is people with disabilities are being pushed to one side because governments are not making the money available to support them through the system or to actually assist in businesses to take them on. And the assistance you've mentioned is one of those things. But my point is, so much is being promised at the moment. We've already had Bill talking a minute ago about how he'll review the single parents pension after having taken it away. We know that they need to increase New Start. We know carers need more. We know people with disabilities need to be supported. What that means is we have to get serious about talking about who can afford to pay more so that we can support people in the way that we need to.
Okay,
and that's why the Greens are saying let's raise that money.
A brief response. We will be coming to this question in more detail, so a brief response.
Just before we dismiss, you know, from either, oh, well, you know, Labor's got to do something. On this issue of the employment, I'm not saying it costs a lot to change people's attitudes. What I am suggesting is that if we look at people with impairment differently, and if we stop just looking at their appearance or a particular attribute and look at the whole person, that doesn't actually cost a lot of subsidy. It just means that we have to change the way people look at people with disabilities. And let's not kill a good idea, Christine, I'm just saying on some sort of point score on the money. This one is a cheap way.
It's not a point score.
I beg your pardon, all right, not a point score, but it's a cheap way. This is a cheap way to help a lot of people out, which is saying employ more people with disabilities.
I think it's great.
So, Tim
Tony, just while we're on that, I was at a recruiting conference and a woman came to me and said, look, I've got this 18-year-old boy, he's got spinal bifida, he's having a hell of a time getting a job. I have a hell of a time explaining to employees that, you know, he wants to work. What should I say? And I said, well, I don't know all that much about the condition, but I'm
betting that of the list of difficult things in that guy's day, answering the phones would be right down the bottom.